Welcome to Beck. Those of you who are new, actually, I think none of you are new. No, there is one new person. We meet every Monday here in Haynes Hall at noon and also via Zoom to enjoy a long series of talks by people interested in behavior, evolution, and culture. So today's speaker is Carolyn Schuppli, who's from the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior in Constance. And her talk will be skill acquisition and life history towards a better understanding of cognitive evolution. And then next week, we have our final Beck talk of this quarter. Laurel Fogarty from a different MPI, the one for evolutionary anthropology, will talk about cultural rescue, avoiding extinction with gene culture coevolution.
Susan, I believe that next week is a holiday. You mean the
I'm sorry, the week after that. Thank you. Yeah, Memorial Day and then Laurel Fogarty. Correct. So I think we're ready for Carolyn to share her screen and start the talk, and put your questions in the chat, and she'll answer them when she feels like doing it, probably in the end.
Good. Hello, everybody. Can you see the right screen? Can you see my slide?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So yeah, maybe first, if you suddenly cannot hear me well anymore, then please somebody let me know, because the microphone of my computer sometimes is a bit strange. So yeah, but thanks, Susan, for the introduction. So as Susan said, I'm going to talk about skill acquisition and life history, and what we can learn from these two traits about cognitive evolution. So certainly one of the most intriguing unsolved questions in evolutionary biology is, how did large brains and advanced cognition evolve? So we see large brains in humans, but also in a range of other species. And now if we look at these species, we see that they have many complex skills. So these skills include things like tool use or other extractive foraging techniques. They also include things like being able to find food sources in complex or variable habitats. And now certainly not all of these skills, but some of these or most of these skills provide individuals with fitness benefits. Ecological skills, for example, allow individuals to exploit the resources in their habitats more efficiently, or to exploit novel resources. And then the extra calories that individuals get through these skills then help to pay for the high energetic costs of their large brains. And so because it is these skills that decide over an individual's fitness and not cognitive potential per se, the evolutionary relevant unit for selection and cognition is skills and knowledge repertoires. So now what is interesting is that most of these skills in these large brain species, they're not present at birth. So in fact, large brain species are very unskilled at birth, and their skills then only emerge gradually during development. And most of these skills are acquired through some form of learning. And that means that the development of these skills is dependent on the inputs individuals receive during their development. And these inputs, they can be from the social or non-social domain. And so in order to understand cognitive evolution, we need to understand which conditions allow for complex and efficient learning. Now, we expect that selection for efficient learning is strongest in large brain species, and that's because of two main reasons. So if we look at the relation between brain size and the amount of learning that happens during development, we see that larger brain species learn much more during development than smaller brain species. And so in species that have to learn a lot, the effects of increased learning speed are much bigger than in other species. So for example, if we increase learning efficiency twofold, the delta of these obtained skills during development will be much larger in a species like a chimpanzee than compared to, for example, in a species like a mouse. So faster skill acquisition also means that individuals become competent earlier. So they reach their adult-like skill sets earlier, which then means that they can start reproducing earlier, which overall accelerates reproductive rates. And that also happens much more pronounced in large brain species than in small brain species, because these large brain species also have disproportionately long developmental periods. So this means that one of the most powerful questions to ask in order to understand cognitive evolution is, when and how do large brain species acquire their skill sets? And more precisely, this includes asking how skill acquisition relates to life history events, what learning mechanisms are being used, and what social and environmental factors affect skill acquisition. So the main study species of my research group are orangutans, so large-brained apes. Orangutans develop even more slowly than other apes. So they, females, for example, start reproducing only around the age of 15 to 16 years. They wean their offspring at around, when the offspring is around 6 to 8 years old. So they breastfeed them up to 8 years. Like all other apes, orangutans have expansive skill repertoires, and they're born very unskilled. So in other words, they have to learn a lot. And then what makes orangutans uniquely interesting to study skill acquisition is the fact that they are the only great ape with a semi-solitary lifestyle. So for a large fraction of their time, individuals are on their own, which means that they depend on their own knowledge and cannot rely on the knowledge of other individuals. And on top of that, all of these factors, they vary between and within populations. So populations and individuals within populations differ in how fast they develop, how large their skill sets are, and how sociable they are. And this natural variation is, of course, a fantastic tool to study how these different traits evolve. So the main study site where we study orangutans is the SWOC Orangutan Research Site. SWOC was established in the 1990s by Karel van Schaik. Since Karel's retirement, I run SWOC through the SWOC project, which is a foundation, or which we turned into a foundation a couple of years ago, which nowadays covers the operating costs of the site. So, so far we have around, or a bit more than 27,000 observation hours on more than 200 individuals. And at the moment, we follow 50 of those individuals regularly. In a way, SWOC is a very rewarding site to study orangutans because it has the highest density of orangutans of any known site. We study Sumatran orangutans at SWOC, so Pongo Abeli. In many aspects, the SWOC orangutans are a bit unlike other orangutans. For orangutan standards, at least, they are highly gregarious, so they show high levels of social tolerance, and we have associations of up to 25 individuals. Also, the SWOC orangutans, they show very broad and complex skill repertoires, which includes habitual and flexible tool use in different contexts. And SWOC orangutans hunt, so they hunt small monkeys, squirrels, and other animals. Aside from SWOC, we also have access to data collected at other orangutan sites, mainly the Tuanan research site in Borneo. Maria van Noordwijk ran Tuanan for many years. Now Tuanan is being run by Erin Vogel and Suchi Utamiatmoko. And I collaborate with Erin and Suchi and still have access to their data sets. So as I said before, these orangutan populations, they differ in things like life history, speed, in how sociable the orangutans are, in the complexity and size of their cultural repertoires, and also food availability differs between these orangutan habitats. So let's start with when do large brain species acquire their skill sets? So as I said before, one of the reasons why orangutans are so interesting to study skill acquisition is the fact that they have to learn a lot. They, for example, eat more than 200 different food items. And many of the skills that orangutans have are quite complex. So for example, these food items, a lot of them need processing before they can be ingested. So we divide orangutan food items according to how many steps of processing it takes before they can be ingested. So processing step 0 means that an item can just be picked and ingested as a whole. Processing step 1 means that one step of processing is involved, for example, peeling or biting open a fruit or spitting out a seed. Processing step 4 means that 4 such steps need to be combined. And processing step 5 are all feeding techniques that include tool use. So now we come to the first video. So I'll quickly stop sharing so that Susan can show the first video, would be tool 1. Perfect, thank you so much.
Here we go.
So this is one of our adult females, Sarabi, and she's preparing a stick tool. So she just peeled a stick and bit the end of the stick to make like a little brush. And now she's inserting the stick into a so-called nesia fruit. She does that to get the seeds out of the nesia fruit. The fruit is filled with very stingy hair, and she wants to avoid having to jam her fingers inside the valves of the fruit, so she uses this stick tool. We could actually go to the second video. Perfect. So here we have Ellie, a juvenile female, and she's using a big stick tool to try and get access to a sweat bee nest inside a tree trunk. And as you can see, she's much less competent than Sarabi was in what she's doing. So she's trying. The tool seems very big to me for the context she's using it in. She just changed the side of the tool, and now she realized it's not working out at all. So she tries to shorten the stick. Ellie is, as I said, a juvenile, and it does in fact take orangutans multiple years and even into adulthood to become a fully proficient tool users. Okay, then I would continue with the presentation. Yep. Do you see the slides again, I hope?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so the results that will follow are based on very detailed data that we're collecting on the development of around 40 orangutan immatures and their mothers. And for some of these individuals, we now have data all the way from birth into adulthood, which is many years. So for food, or for the timing of skill acquisition, we, for example, looked on, or we focused mainly on foraging skills so far. Like, for example, a food recognition skill, so the ability to recognize food in the forest, which we approximated by diet repertoire size. So this is the size of the diet repertoire in percent of the adult female's repertoire size over age. And as you can see, it takes immature orangutans many years to develop adult-like repertoire sizes, and they reach adult-like repertoire sizes around the age of 7 to 8 years. We also found that females reach adult-like repertoire sizes faster, or they reach larger repertoires than males do, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk here. Just wanted to mention it because it's kind of obvious on the graph. We also looked at food processing skills, which we approximated by the speed at which individuals process their food, so feeding rates. We found very similar patterns as for food recognition skills, namely that adult-like feeding rates are reached around the age of weaning. And interestingly, we also found that adult-like feeding rates are reached later at SWAC, where skill repertoires are larger and more complex than at the Tuanan population. I will get back to this in more detail later, but the SWAC individuals have more to learn and more complex skills to learn. And it seems like this means that they reach the competence or adult-like competence in their skills later than their peers in Tuanan. So these findings suggest that orangutans need multiple years to reach foraging competence. Both food recognition and food processing skills coincide with weaning. And this means that the acquisition of these skills, they might set weaning age. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because shortly after orangutans are being weaned, they start to range independently. So at that point, they need to have their skills in place. We then wanted to see if this pattern of skill competence coinciding with weaning also holds for other species. So we looked at the connection between skill development and life history in mammals and birds. We, for example, used published data on 34 mammal species, and we found that just as in the orangutans, in most mammal species, foraging skill competence is reached shortly or just around the age of, or is reached before the age of weaning. So in some species, it just coincides with weaning, and in very few species, these foraging skill competence is reached after weaning. And we found that actually in these very few species where skills develop until after weaning, that's all species that have some form of post-weaning provisioning, such as food sharing with juveniles. We also found that species that live in more complex foraging niches, so where they have to learn a lot, that they reach adult-like foraging competence later. So this is in line with the results that I showed you before on the 2 orangutan populations. And we found that the complexity of the foraging niche is correlated with larger brain sizes. So where individuals have to learn more, they tend to have larger brains and with longer developmental periods. In a follow-up studies several years later, we then looked at the development of manipulative motor skills in different primate species in more detail. So the skills that individuals need to process their food. And for this, my colleague Sandra Helstab, she looked at 36 different species in zoos for over 7 years. And she found that the larger brain the species is, the later their skill levels start to develop. And at the same time, we found that the more complex level skills that they take longer to develop. So what this means is altogether that these large brain species, they're born less skilled. They develop their manipulative motor skills later, but over a longer time to then eventually reach higher skill levels as adults. So these results on the orangutans and the comparative results suggest that complex skills take a long time to develop. Skill competence coincides with the end of the dependency period or the provisioning period, and that the length of the dependency period may set the amount of learning and thus the complexity of the skills that can be acquired. So now that we have covered the when, let's turn to the how. So how do large brain species acquire their skills? We looked at several types of learning in orangutans. Today, I will focus on social learning. We predicted that social learning would be actually important for orangutan skill acquisition because learning from other individuals increases learning efficiency. So it, for example, increases the signal to noise ratio of information and makes it easier for learning individuals to focus on relevant information. But it also allows for learning without time-intense and often dangerous individual innovation. Now that would be the third video. And while Susan is putting up the video, I'm going to switch on my light. So as a potential means to social learning, we used peering. And this video should show you what peering is. So you saw just Lisa, an adult female that brought up some food from the forest floor. And here comes Louis, her at the back then 3-year-old infant. So he's getting into position and he peers. So this is peering. So it's close range observation of the activities of another individual. So infant orangutans peer a lot in different contexts. Juveniles peer. And even adult orangutans peer. And now, so I mean, yes, the SWAC orangutans are more sociable, but they still like to keep distance to each other. And so this peering is very distinct because all of a sudden they're kind of in each other's faces. So yeah, it's very easy to recognize when orangutans are peering. Okay, then I'll continue with the presentation. So we found loads of evidence that peering is means to social learning. We, for example, found that peering is followed by selective practice of the observed behavior. So these are rates of exploration with the same object as the peering target is feeding on before and after the peering event. And as you can see, immatures, they explore around 3 times more frequently after the peering event compared to before. We also found that immatures peer more frequently at their mothers when she's feeding on items that are more complex to process. So this is peering rate versus food item complexity. And as you can see, the more complex the item is, the higher the peering rates are. We found a reverse effect for item frequency. So this is the frequency of the food item in the mother's diet against peering rates. And as you can see, immature orangutans peer less often for items that they see more frequently. And so all in all, immature orangutans, they peer for things that are complex or rare, which is of course exactly what you would predict if peering was used for learning. We also tried to quantify the reliance of wild orangutans on observational social learning, and we found that they peer quite a lot, around 40,000 times in a lifetime. So these are extrapolated cumulative peering counts of the Sumatran orangutans over age. Most peering happens during infancy and juvenility. And of course, this makes sense because it is exactly these immature orangutans that still have to learn stuff. And for them, the whole world is kind of new. And so especially when they're young, orangutans kind of peer at almost everything. So they peer at complex things like tool use, but they also peer at a lot of different feeding techniques, at nest building, at certain moves, or at how to take care of their infants, how to make umbrellas to protect themselves and from the rain, and so on. And this peering behavior, observational learning in general, is not just an orangutan thing, and we were also not the first ones to describe it. So in chimps, the concept has been described a long time ago, and it was called education by master and apprenticeship. White-faced capuchin monkeys pay more visual attention to difficult to process and rare food. So that's highly, highly similar to what we see in the orangutans. Brown capuchins have been shown to watch the best nutcrackers. So observational social learning seems to be common in many primates, and in particular in these large-brained primate species. To look at who orangutans learn from, we looked at peering preferences. So this is the proportion of peering directed at the mother over age. Above this dashed line means that there is more peering at the mother, and below means that there is more peering at other individuals. And these peering proportions, they are corrected for the amount of time individuals spend in 2 meters of these 2 classes of role models. So they should really depict preferences of these individuals. And so we found that young infants, they peer almost exclusively at their mothers. This would be the next video. It's called Peer Practice. Here you again see Louis when he was around 6 months old, and he was just peering. That was not on the video, but so he just tried to eat the same thing as his mother Lisa is eating, and he doesn't seem to like it at all. But then he just goes and tries again. So infant orangutans, they spend a lot of time watching their mothers and then trying to do exactly what she does, no matter whether they like it or not. They just have this intense urge to watch their moms and do exactly the same thing as the mother is doing. Okay, then I'll continue.
Sure.
So, but as you can see in this graph, this preference for the mother, it doesn't always stay like this. So as they get older, the motivation to peer at individuals other than the mother then increases with age. And especially during late juvenility, orangutans are most interested in what other individuals do. So this would be the next video.
points.
Yeah, perfect. So here we have Julia, a juvenile female who's peering at an adult male. And yeah, at that age, they're very, very interested in what other individuals do. So he just keeps on feeding and she keeps on watching. Interestingly, this peering behavior is usually tolerated by the other individual. So even though it's very close range, other individuals usually don't seem to care when individuals are peering. Okay. Mhm. Still waiting for the presentation to pick up again. Okay. Okay, good. So this pattern of increasing interest in non-mother role models with increasing age, it has also been described in many other primate species. So it's not, again, it's not an orangutan thing only, but it's a pattern that we see in many other species too. So to understand the results that will follow now, it is important to know the dispersal pattern of orangutans. So just before they reach adulthood, orangutan males, they leave their natal area to then move from one area to the next, the so-called unflanched males. So unflanched males look very similar to females. After some years, some orangutan males then develop secondary sexual features and turn into so-called flanched males. So they have these cheek pads around their head and a throat sac. But not all males do. Some of these males, they settle in an area, some don't. But in any case, they don't end up in the same area that they grew up in. So they roam around or settle in areas that are far away from their natal range. And thus, these areas are probably also very different from their natal area. Orangutan females, on the other hand, they stay in their natal area when they reach adulthood, and they raise their offspring in a home range that overlaps very heavily with the range that they grew up in themselves. So we wanted to know if these differences in their dispersal pattern affect orangutan social learning before and after dispersal. And this was work that I did with my student Beatrice Ehmann. And so we found that this shift in social interest from the mother to other individuals, that it develops actually differently in immature males and females. So as you can see, whereas in boys here on the right in blue, this interest in other individuals increases indeed gradually with age. In girls, it increases, but then drops again. So in general, immature males seem to be more interested in non-mother role models than immature girls are. We also found differences in terms of the identities of these non-mother role models. So we, for example, found that girls are most interested in local residents, such as adult females or local juveniles, and boys are more interested in immigrant individuals, such as immigrant males or non-local juveniles. So this is the proportion of non-mother peering directed at residents and non-resident individuals. So the mother is, of course, excluded from this graph as a peering target. And now these differences in learning patterns, they actually make a lot of sense, because when orangutan males disperse into new areas, they will most likely have to learn about the habitats of these new areas. So it makes sense for them to be generally interested in foreign knowledge. And philopatric females, on the contrary, they should focus on local residents and learn mostly from local residents about the local area. And indeed, as a result of these differences in social interest, immature males and females, they seem to learn different things. So females, for example, develop repertoires that are more similar to the repertoires of their mothers. So as you can see, for example, in this graph, by the time they reach independence, so at around the age of 8 years, females show a larger overlap with their mother's diet repertoires than males do. And males, on the other hand, they eat more things that their mothers don't eat. So we now knew that immature males, they show a preference for foreign role models, but does this really affect their learning during dispersal? So Julia Mürchen, one of my PhD students, is currently looking at whether orangutan unflanched and flanched males indeed use peering to learn about the ecology of their new habitat during dispersal. This is work that is now in review, so I can't really show it here, but we got some very exciting results. So to sum up the part about orangutan observational social learning, so we found loads of evidence that orangutan observational social learning pervades the lives of young orangutans. We found that immature orangutans rely heavily on observational social learning through peering, mainly at their mothers, but also other role models, and that immature males and females, that they differ in the development of the social interests and in their learning outcomes, as expected by their dispersal patterns. What always strikes me about this observational learning is that mothers are surprisingly passive. So interactive forms of social learning, they're even more efficient than purely observational social learning. And orangutans, they certainly have the cognitive capacities for these interactive forms of social learning. So we wanted to investigate whether orangutan mothers are as passive as they seem during learning of their offspring. And that's why we looked at food solicitations. That would be the next video. Perfect, thanks a lot. So this is a classic food solicitation event. It's again Louis. Here he is around 3 years old again, and he just took a piece of bark from his mother Lisa. Lisa is opening the bark. Louis cannot feed on bark yet, or he cannot open the bark yet, and so he got it. He needs to get the pieces from his mom. Okay, then I continue. So Mickey, who did her master's thesis with me, she looked at around 1,300 food solicitations events that we had collected at SWOC. And when we looked at food solicitation rates by the immatures, so how often these immatures would solicit food, we found that overall food solicitation rates, they decreased with age. So these are food solicitation rates over age. As you can see, there is a nice decrease. We found higher solicitation rates for more complex food items. So this is indicated in the different colors in this graph here. And as you can see, food solicitation rates for easy to process items, they are not just lower, but they also seem to drop faster than food solicitation events for more complex items. And for tool use, which is indicated here in this light blue color, you see that food solicitation rates, they stay high almost throughout the entire developmental period. And that does make sense because immatures indeed take many years to become proficient tool users. We also looked at the mother's behavior during these food solicitations. And so this is the result on the reaction of the mothers during food solicitation events. Orangutan mothers, we found that they almost never actively solicit or share food. They never actively share food with their infants, or almost never. But we found that they show varying levels of tolerance towards the food solicitations of their offspring. So we looked at the basic outcome of these food solicitation events, which either is tolerant, which means that the mother was giving away the food or let the offspring take the food, or not tolerant, which means that she refused to give food. And we found that the tolerance of the mother peaks exactly at around the age at which the immatures are learning their feeding skills, so between the age of 3 and 6 years. And also tolerance levels, they increase with increasing complexity of the process of the food item. So that's again what you can see in the different colors. So the more complex a food item is to process, the more tolerant the mothers are. And they also seem to stay longer for these more complex to process items, such as tool use. So to sum up these results on interactive social learning in orangutans, immature orangutans use or seem to use food solicitations to learn about food items. Orangutan mothers then reactively adjust their behavior during food solicitations, seemingly to facilitate feeding skill acquisition in their offspring. And interestingly, there's almost no active involvement of the mothers even during these food solicitations, but they reactively adjust their tolerance levels. So I haven't shown you all of this, but to give you the complete picture, we found that orangutans, they acquire their skills through a mix of independent exploration, observational social learning through peering, and subsequent practice of the observed behavior, as well as through learning from these reactive role models during food solicitations. The different types of learning are timed differently. So first we have, one second. We have independent learning, which peaks earliest, which is then followed by observational social learning. And then later we have the peak in these reactive role models learning. And accordingly, the types of skills that they seem to learn then increase in complexity over age as well. We also looked at the factors that affect orangutan learning. I only have time to show you one of these factors of many different ones that we found. So we focus on what seems to be the strongest effect, which is sociability. So our two main study sites differ in sociability. The orangutans at SWOC are much more sociable than the ones in Tuanan. So it means that they spend more time in association. And when they are in associations, they show higher levels of tolerance. So they, for example, spend a larger share of their association time in close proximity. And this means that individuals in SWOC, they have much more opportunities to learn from their conspecifics than individuals at Tuanan. And this difference is, of course, the perfect natural experiment to look at the effects of these differences in opportunities for social learning on learning and skill acquisition. So to investigate how sociability affects social learning in orangutans, we first compared peering in these two wild populations. And as we expected, we found that there's much less peering in the less sociable population in Tuanan here in blue, where individuals spend less time together and are less tolerant. So these individuals, they peer around 9,000 times in a lifetime, which is still a lot, but much less than the SWOC population. But that was kind of expected, because if individuals are less sociable, then there is, of course, also less opportunities for peering. If we plot these patterns of peering again that I showed you a couple of slides ago, so this is all peering at the mothers, and now the dots are colored differently according to the study site. And you can see that the more sociable population, SWOC in red, these peering rates are always a bit higher than in the less sociable population in Tuanan. And so importantly, this is all peering at the mother. So during the dependency period, which means that these individuals, they have their mothers constantly around to peer. So these differences between the populations here, they cannot be caused by differences in opportunities to peer. And these graphs also show that the individuals at the more sociable population, they peer more frequently, even if you control for differences in, for example, complexity of the food item or the rarity of the food item. And so this altogether suggests that the individuals at the more sociable population, they have an increased motivation to peer. And this increased motivation to peer, that could be the result of either genetic differences or developmental differences between the two study sites. Genetic differences, because these are also two different species. So it's not just two different populations, but also two different orangutan species. We also found that opportunities for social learning affect more than just social learning. So for example, across populations, we found that the rates of independent exploration, which is a measure of independent individual learning, that these exploration rates, they're much higher at more sociable populations than at less sociable populations. So these are hourly rates of exploratory behavior over age. As you can see, immatures at the more sociable population seem to be more exploratory than at the less sociable population. We also found exactly the same difference for adults and juveniles, or older juveniles. So even during adulthood and juvenility, immatures at the more sociable population, individuals at the more sociable population are more exploratory than at the less sociable population. But what kind of effects are these? Are these immediate effects of just immediate or differences in the immediate conditions? Are these developmental effects, or are these even intrinsic differences between the species? So to figure this out, we looked at effects within populations, and we found that within populations, adults and juveniles are more exploratory when they are in association with others compared to when they're on their own. And that, of course, speaks for immediate effects. But we also found that for the immatures, we found that when they grow up with more sociable mothers, so mothers that spend more time associating with other individuals, these immatures then later show increased exploratory tendencies. So the more opportunities these immature orangutans have during their infancy, the more exploratory they seem to be in later life. And this, of course, means that there are also developmental effects at work. So this was all evidence for effects of sociability on learning, but does sociability also affect learning outcomes? We indeed found that the repertoires are larger and more complex at populations that are more sociable. So if we, for example, look at the distribution of these different processing steps, we found that at SWAC, the more sociable population, there are more complex, or there are more techniques that involve complex processing than at the less sociable population. And we also found that many of the items that occur at both sides, like for example, insects or certain species of fruits that we have at both sides, that individuals at the more sociable population, they have more different techniques to process these items compared to the less sociable population. And so now, if you remember the results that I showed you before, the more sociable population is not just the population where skill sets are more complex and broad, but it is also the population where learning takes longer. So these individuals, they learn longer in more sociable populations, and they achieve broader and more complex repertoires. And one of the big questions that remains now, of course, is to what extent sociability or opportunities for social learning indeed affect innate learning ability. So now we are on these questions with our current students, but my colleagues Sophia Forst and Laura Damerius, they already did cognitive tests with captive orangutans, which are highly suggestive. So they compared Sumatran individuals and Bornean orangutans, and they found that Sumatran orangutans outperform Bornean orangutans in these cognitive tests. So in simple terms, on top of these developmental and immediate effects of sociability, the generally more sociable species may also have higher innate learning ability. There is also evidence for this if you look across a wider range of species. So for example, among primates, you see that species which have higher innovation frequencies also show higher social learning frequencies. And in birds, you see that species that can learn socially are also the ones that show high independent learning ability. And so to sum up this part, we found loads of evidence that opportunities for social learning affect individuals' learning rates or social learning rates and tendencies. They also seem to affect individual rates of learning and the individual learning abilities. And on top of that, we found that on the population level, opportunities for social learning seem to affect population skill repertoire sizes and complexities. So to sum up the key points of this talk, we found that large brain species, they need long dependency periods or periods during which they're provisioned. These long provisioned periods allow them to learn during this time, and these periods, they seem to buffer against reduced foraging efficiency that these individuals likely have during their time of immaturity because they haven't reached full skill competence yet. The need to acquire complex skills may have co-evolved with the length of the dependency period. The results on the orangutans suggest that large brain species learn through high fidelity forms of social learning, which includes observational learning through peering or interactive forms of social learning, such as learning through food solicitations, or in other species, maybe teaching. We found striking evidence that learning is shaped by social opportunities, in that opportunities for social learning have a positive effect on social learning, independent learning, and populations' repertoires. that's the end of my talk. Thanks a lot for the invitation to present here. And I also want to thank many, many people and organizations. This includes my group at MPI, and also our local staff at SWOC that kept the site running also during the pandemic. None of that would be possible without these people. So thanks a lot. And thank you all for listening. Okay, then I think we move on to the questions part.
I see Anne has a question.
Yeah, I can go first if there's nobody in the room that has one. I guess maybe not. This was really, really interesting, and thank you for the nice presentation and the really wonderful videos as well. I was wondering if I understand you correctly, the males showed a greater tendency to explore different types of foods and also peer being at different individuals. And also you found this correlation between maternal sociability and exploratory behavior. So I was just wondering, it's kind of a simple question, if you think there's a connection maybe between the two, do mothers of males, are they more sociable than the mothers of females?
That's a fantastic question. And we wanted to look at this. So a lot of things, sex differences I think is a huge aspect in orangutans, and we don't know to what extent they're mediated by the mothers. We just don't have the sample sizes yet. So we didn't find any effect of sex, but when you plot the data that there were patterns in there. So we think that there are things going on. We just have to maybe wait a couple of years to obtain larger sample sizes. But yes, these things could very well be mediated by the mothers. Also, we do think that they associate with different individuals depending on whether they have a male or female infant. It's just that in the current data set, we couldn't find any significant signal for that.
Thanks, that makes sense. Oh, wait.
Any more questions?
I don't have to.
Daniel?
So thanks for a really interesting presentation. You mentioned that that individuals seem selective about their choice of models, right? So that they're peering more at the more skilled individuals. First, a kind of elementary question just about the method, and then maybe a more substantive one. So if it's the case that the frequency with which adults process difficult to process foods is in part a function of their skill level, then are you actually measuring selectivity on the basis of skill or just opportunity? That is, a more skilled individual will present more opportunities for peering than a less skilled individual. So the learner may not be sensitive to the skill level as much as it is just the frequency.
Yeah. So I mean, these differences in feeding speed, they're quite subtle, right? So it's not that individuals. So if you peer at a less competent individual, it's not that you'd never see success. The only exception to that is maybe tool use, where you really, and there I would agree with your proposition, so that it does not make sense to watch an incompetent tool user, and if for tool use, you may really have to watch an adult individuals to see somebody reaching success and to see what's the goal of the tool use. But with all other fruits, if you peer repeatedly, you do see these individuals processing these fruits, for example. You do see them eating them. It's just that it's maybe a bit slower than with the more competent individuals. But yes, of course, we cannot really disentangle these two things. And it's a very nice thing to think about. So we were thinking along these lines for tool use, but not so much for the other food items yet.
So my follow-up question to that then is whether you see a pattern where when individuals are first learning, they're just opportunistic with regard to the models they peer at, and then as their own skill levels increase, they become more selective. right? And you can imagine that for several reasons. One, they may not appreciate the differences in skill level between different models when they're naive, right? And second, the payoffs of discriminating between them are higher later in the learning process than they are early in the learning process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some basic rules at work. So we also look at orangutans in zoos now, and even those orangutans, they have this very basic rule that you always peer at an older individual. So when you're very young, then almost everybody else is older than you, and this rule seems to be like you just watch who is older than you, and then as you yourself become older, your pool of role models that are still interesting to you becomes narrower. So yeah, that's probably because you, first of all, you realize what the skill is all about that you're watching. You might not understand much of this when you're young. And then it could also have to do something with payoff. So you want to see success, and that's why you need to watch more competent individuals.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Really interesting.
Any other questions?
Question. One thing I always wonder about is for one thing, thanks for this beautiful talk. You had so many different analyses in one talk, and it was really nice to see the whole research program in one place. I was also struck by how many parallels there are between the capuchins and the orangutans. I mean, almost all of our graphs that we've done the same analysis turned out the same. One thing I always struggle with a bit is, so we think that there must be selection for them to do these things that have all the social learning for complex foraging skills, but that only makes sense if they really get a lot of nutritional value out of these really difficult skills. And I always worry about that a bit for the capuchins, because the very most, like the 5-step ones, which are the ones for which I see competence continuing past weaning, it's not a huge proportion of their diet. And I always wonder, is it really valid to assume that there's a lot of selective pressure to do this really tough stuff? Have you thought about that all for orangutans? Maybe it's a different case for orangutans, and that Nija is like the best food there is or something, and it's not as much of a dilemma for you as it is for me to interpret the data.
No, absolutely. We have thought about that. And yes, Nija it does give them a lot of calories. So I think, and they do get a lot of seeds out of one of these fruits. So there we really think that that's a very good skill to have, and that will lead to a lot of calories in a relatively short time. But the puzzling thing is insect tool use. So, I mean, yes, if it's honey, then maybe, but if they're using tools to get some termites, But then again, it could be protein, so that that's just a good way for them to get to protein, and protein might be rare in their diet in general. So yeah. What we find puzzling as well is that they keep on trying these difficult techniques without being successful for so long. So without having any reward, it still seems to pay off to just keep on trying and waste all that energy on trying to get to these things, even though you can only get to these things after many, many years. So that to me, it suggests that the selection on this urge to try must be very high, because for a long time, there is no payoff, there's no reward, and you just keep on trying and practicing.
Yes, I think orangutans and capuchins are similar in their extreme persistence. I mean, I think orangutans think about it harder before they dive in than capuchins do. I always have fun comparing with Ann Russin, our videos. But yeah, similar with the capuchins, the hardest food is this Panama, and they don't seem to eat the nut part, which seems like the most nutritious part, but they will work for years at competence just to get this slimy little film. It's kind of like a mamonchina, like a lychee fruit. You know, it doesn't seem like it's that great for the amount of effort and the stinging hairs and everything that goes into it. It's sort of a puzzle to me.
And have you analyzed the nutritional composition of that?
No, I haven't. It just looks like so little food, and it takes more than an hour sometimes to get one open. It just seems insane. But they're crazy about stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
I was intrigued also by your brief mention of how different kinds of socially learned traits might be acquired differently, or they might choose their models accordingly. I think the trait on the list of the traditions from SWAC that has always amused and intrigued me the most is that raspberry sound when they make the nest. Do you have anything to say about how that spreads any more than what was in that paper?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's just, so we now know that they make more different sounds than just a raspberry when they're making nests. So some individuals also do nest smacks, which was thought to only occur at other populations. We definitely have some nest smackers. And we do have the feeling that these are juveniles that might have learned it from incoming males. So there seems to be, juveniles may go through a phase. I have to be very careful now because we haven't really analyzed this, but juvenile females, they may go through a phase, and males, where they learn from these immigrant males. And that's also right during the time when they start associating with these individuals a lot. So then we see a juvenile female that comes from a raspberry mother that suddenly starts smacking, and coincidentally or not coincidentally, she's also associating with males who are nest smackers. So there's loads of anecdotal evidence for that there's definitely cultural spread, and that different periods of life make you more susceptible to influence from different types of individuals. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just in the nest building context, but we also have males that they make a very special sound when they're eating certain liana. And we now have 2 juvenile females who started making that sound as well while they're eating these lianas. So again, very low sample sizes, but very suggestive.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Any more questions? I'm curious to hear what you're doing next. You mentioned the cognition project.
Yeah, exactly. We're doing more cognition. We also want to look at individual differences in, for example, learning speed or learning in general, or how the two relate, so that whether individuals who are more attentive peers or more frequent peers, whether you can see that in their skill acquisition trajectories. Then also that will, of course, open, as soon as we have enough sample sizes that are high enough for this, we can also look at sex differences in more detail, because they really seem to go on different paths, these males and females, from a very early age on.
Mm-hmm. I think
there's
Dasha has a question.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I have actually 2 questions. One is about whether sociability is, like, I guess you didn't talk much about this in your talk, but is sociability in orangutans ever driven by the richer environment? Meaning, if they have more free time or more, they're more relaxed for some reason, they act more like captive orangutans who are more social. And then I was also, since I'm interested in play in primates, wondering if you ever see play as a means for learning new skills, like foraging skills, and whether that could also be associated with, if the environment is richer, they have more free time to play and be social.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything I showed you on the effect of sociability is to be taken with a grain of salt, because that's the more sociable population is also the population where the habitat is much richer. So disentangling these 2 effects is very, very difficult. We do have some evidence that it is indeed sociability, but yes, habitats differ a lot, and that seems to drive association frequencies, tolerance of individuals when they're in associations, and so on. And then as to the play, do you mean independent play or social play?
I guess either one, but I guess I was imagining more like object play, since it's with food items.
Yeah, it's a pity that I didn't show the object play and object exploration results more, but they do go through a whole developmental sequence of like high object play and object exploration rates during early infancy, which is in orangutans around 2 years of age. And then it drops, and then it reaches almost zero rates of 0 events per hour in late juvenility, and then that low rates continue during adulthood. And that those high rates, they're exactly during the age where they're also learning a lot and improving their skills. So there's loads of evidence that that's actually also means to learning for orangutans. Interestingly, so we differentiate between object play and exploratory object manipulations. So for us, object play is mostly repetitive. The focus is not really on the object, and they're kind of manipulating it in a repetitive, playful, or non-purpose, not immediately purposeful way. And then with exploration, it's more focused on the object. And we do see slightly different developmental trajectories for the 2 different types of object manipulations. And one of them, the exploratory one, is more affected by differences in food availability or differences in experienced sociability than the playful one.
Interesting. Thank you.
Daniel?
So I was struck by in the peering, at least in the examples that you showed, by the incredible closeness, right? So it strikes me that there are at least 3 explanations that come to mind, and I'm curious. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but so, one is that the orangutan visual system, that they just have poor resolution except at very low distances like this. I don't know anything about it, so you can easily tell me if that's right or wrong. The second is that there may be aspects of manipulation, like what the animal does with its tongue, for example, that may be important, and you can't see that unless you're very close. But a third might be some kind of bond testing, right? That you're part of your selection of models is how tolerant they are. So there may be, 2 individuals that are equivalently skilled, but one of them doesn't like, having learners in his face as much. And so, you're actively poking, as it were, to see essentially how tolerant this individual is, and thus how much you want to learn from them in the future. And I'm curious whether any of those or some additional explanation obtains.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I should mention is that when I chose the peering videos, I kind of wanted to show the most impressive ones, and to show how obvious this peering is. And so there was probably a bias that I did choose the ones that show the closest distances. And there's, for example, also a lot of nest peering, and that happens usually at the distance between 2 and 5 meters. So, and also some of the food peering it's usually like ½ a meter. So within a quick arm's reach, but most of it is not as close as the videos maybe suggested. So I would say exploration 2 and 3. So for some things you do need to be very close to see the details, because they do a lot of things with their tongues, but also some fine manipulations with their hands. But then yes, it is definitely, there is a social component to this, and that might even be the mechanism of this. I don't think that these orangutans, they get up in the morning and they think, oh, I go peer so that I can learn something, but something must trigger that peering, right? And for young immatures, it's maybe some innate fascination to attend to your mothers. And for juveniles, it might very well be to test, am I allowed to feed right next to you, or am I allowed to be with you? How tolerant are you? So it might be a whole social aspect to this. And that social aspect then, of course, opens that window of knowledge transfer, because they do watch and they do see things. But the social component and the tolerance testing is definitely what we think might be going on between these older individuals.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Do you have any more information that you haven't presented in this talk about which kinds of individuals are more likely to be innovators?
Yeah.
Personality types or anything like that?
So not as to personality types, but age-wise, juveniles, definitively. So juveniles seem to be the most so also, for example, we have a study now in press where we confronted them with novel objects or a novel experimental apparatus. So basically just the habituation phase of getting them used to the cognitive tests that we're doing with them. And the results show quite clearly that for juveniles, on the one hand, they show the most neophobic reactions. So they seem to be scared of the novelty, but at the same time, they also are most likely to approach, to touch, to watch. So, so they do seem to be the ones that are most likely also about to innovate things, even though they also have most neophobic reactions.
I'm not sure I quite follow that. So they're most neophobic initially, but then once they've gotten over that, then they're the most likely to engage with the testing apparatus?
It's actually at the same time. So as they approach and as they interact, they also show, so we differentiated between neophobia and neophilia, and that we looked at signs of neophobia, we scored them a bit differently than you would, or most of the studies did. So we looked at fear reactions as in kiss squeaks, so sounds that or vocalizations that they make when they're stressed, or scratches, so signs, basically just signs of stress, or let's call it, they're more likely to show signs of stress, but they're also more likely to approach and engage with novelty. So, and it kind of confirms that theory that neophobia and neophilia, they're two different things, and you can be neophobic at the same time as you can be neophilic. So, yeah, quite not what we expected, but interesting.
Yeah, so they're eager to engage, but also sort of terrified and highly aroused by the situation.
Yeah, so in German there is this saying that it's only bravery if you're scared but still do it. Yeah, it's bad translation, but but that kind of nicely applies to this thing, I think.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. And are the juveniles the most innovative in all kinds of things, or just in these is it a puzzle box, like an artificial fruit kind of paradigm, or?
Yeah, it's a very simple problem solving test that looks very naturalistic. I think in general they do show high rates of exploration, but then also that drops very quickly during juvenility. So, and we don't know if they then just become more focused and less playful, and that's why we're not catching these exploration events. But yeah, I would say just in general, the juvenile phase is when they're probably most likely to innovate, I'd say.
Yeah, we find for the Capuchins that the juveniles are most innovative for most kinds of things, except for the social, inventing new kinds of social interactions. That seems to be more an adult thing.
Yeah, super interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of like social inventions.
They're not social enough.
So, yeah, they're even though they're at SWOC, we call them very sociable, but they're it's just don't reach that level, I would say.
Only relative to the Bornean orangutans.
Exactly.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I was pretty ignorant about the SWOC field site and the orangutan community there. So that was really nice to hear about. I'm not sure if this applies to the population that you're able to study, but given the importance of the mother in social learning and the fact that juveniles receive provisioning for such a long period of time, I'm wondering if there are any individuals in that population or in your sample who lost a mother before weaning, and how that impacted maybe their social development and learning.
Yeah, very interesting question. At SWOC, we don't. We have one individual that lost her mother when she was at around 7 years old, and she seems to be doing just fine. So she probably, because that was just 2 years, like they usually get weaned at around the age of 8, and then they stay with their moms at SWOC for until the age of 9. So that doesn't seem to have made too much of a difference. But at the Bornean population, we have several orphans, or we have one orphan and one. So okay, let's focus on the orphan. So that individual then kind of got adopted by his older sister. So, but and that delayed the sister. So in the sister, we then saw a later age of first reproduction. She basically just kind of took over the mother role, cared for her little brother, and which seemed to have delayed her, but made him survive. But he does seem to be weird in almost any aspect. So he is less playful, less exploratory. He's very, he's avoiding associations with other individuals. So that does seem to have a massive effect on their development. But it's difficult to, so these are all very small sample sizes, and that's because orangutans, they just don't die. They survive too well. So they have, if you look at survival in orangutans, it's almost as good as survival in a Swiss population. So that's just, the cases are too few to properly study that. But the few cases that we do have are very suggestive that losing the mother has massive effects on their development.
Thank you.
I have another question.
Mhm.
I was wondering about what you know about the weaning dynamics, and like it tends to be more led by the mother or by the juvenile, and yeah, just what it looks like.
Definitely the mother. So juveniles, very interesting because during the phase, so when the infant is around, or when the immature is around 6.5 to 7.5 years old, the mother, she will start copulating with the males again. And then we see this sudden increase in weaning. It's like a comfort thing that this stressful situation of having a male around seems to kind of increase not weaning, in suckling, seems to increase the suckling rates. But then as latest when the next sibling is on the way, mothers, they push them away. They break nipple contact. They make them retreat. And that leads to a lot of crying and conflict between the mother and her offspring. But then shortly after that, the younger sibling arrives, and then that weaning conflict gets even more intense sometimes, because sometimes the older offspring, it just doesn't seem to get that it needs to keep its distance, and then they go really through this phase of high conflict and a lot of even tantrums and crying in general. So yeah, definitely initiated by the mother, the weaning phase.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Any more questions? If not, I guess we should let Caroline go to bed. It's very late there.
That's okay.
Well, thank you so much. It was just a marvelous talk, and I will probably get back in touch with you with more questions after I've had time to think about it all. It was really marvelous.